All right, welcome everybody. My name is Kelly Albrecht. I am with Last Call Media, uh, building digital products for customers and helping them take that work over and continue it to continuously build innovative products for their customers. So this talk is called Disruption is Coming, and it's kind of a work in progress talk. It was submitted to some Agile conferences for later in the year, so venues like this are a great way to work through some of the content. So some of the content's a little experimental. Some of the transitions between the slides, I'll be seeing what feedback people might have for them, but really I think it's interesting content that it would be really interesting to get into discussions about. Okay, so relevant today, as much as any day, but really we can really feel this now that we face disruptions in our lives all the time. So whether you might need to go to the dentist in a day and suddenly the road to get there is closed, or it could be something bigger. It could be a loved one is sick, or it could be that a pandemic hits and you had a conference all planned out and it was locked and loaded, ready to go. So throughout a lifetime, we will face disruptions of all sizes. Some small, like our alarm didn't go off, some large. I'm sure you can think of some pretty disruptive things to your lives and your goals personally. There's this concept called VUCA. We live in a VUCA world, and VUCA stands for something. It's a concept that originated with students at the U.S. Army War College, and it describes the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It can be used to describe our world today. They were using it to describe the world after the Cold War. A lot has changed over the past few decades now, where we are living in much more of a VUCA world, and our approach to working within that, we need some things become more important. Things like awareness of coming disruptions, awareness of uncertainties. We can't be so sure of some things. We need to have the flexibility for when those things emerge, and the nimbleness and adaptability to respond and recover. In short, we need agility, we need resilience. This is really why things like agile methodologies have really taken over our approach. And it's not just because it's a buzzword, although that's what people have done to it to sell it, but it really is the right approach for the world that a lot of people find themselves in. So how can we better understand, survive, and thrive in this VUCA world? So this is something that even physicists, that anybody that's studying the world and how the world works, are in some way studying this problem, trying to understand what is it that we're all in and how are we all surviving and thriving. So a really interesting place to look, to take a big step back and think about these disruptions in our lives and surviving and thriving in our lives or in our businesses or in anything that we're doing, is to really look at some of the work that theoretical physics is doing. And so I did this, and it was fascinating, and I want to share some of that with you. So here's a quote from the book How Nature Works, one of the more recent theoretical physics books. And physicists are asking these similar questions, right? How can the universe start with a few types of elementary particles at the Big Bang and end up with life, history, economics, and literature, and things like Drupal and things like React and things like Facebook, these incredibly complex things? How does that happen, and how do we fit within that? So something that those that are studying this, the theoretical physicists that are studying this, have identified the way nature works in a VUCA world, or just the way nature works in general. And the concept that that they've written a lot about on this topic is called self-organized criticality. And self-organized criticality is a new way of viewing nature. The basic picture is one where nature is perpetually out of balance, but organized in a poised state. This is the critical state, where anything can happen within well-defined statistical laws. The aim of the science of self-organized criticality is to yield insight into the fundamental question of why nature is complex, not simple, as the laws of physics imply. So the interesting thing here is that traditional physics is very reductive. Like, let's just boil it down to the smallest pieces and understand those, and that is somehow going to explain everything for us. And really what's been recognized and what self-organized criticality is really leaning on and standing on top of is this recognition that nature is complex, and there's a complexity to nature that is important to understand for us to be able to take the right approach and know how to optimize the decisions that we're making to have the right approach. So the way that self-organized criticality explains complexity, and the complexity that we find all of ourselves in the complexity of nature, is through this Sandpile experiment. Okay, so self-organized criticality argues that complex behavior in nature reflects the tendency of large systems with many components to evolve into a poised critical state, way out of balance, where minor disturbances may lead to events that they call avalanches, right? So in a complex, in a state of complexity, there will be what are called avalanches of all sizes. And so if we think back to my second slide, where in our lives we will face disruptions of all sizes, this is an analogy to that. So the Sandpile experiment is one in which a single grain of sand is dropped, and single grains of sand are continued to be dropped until a sand pile emerges. And so up until this point, every single little grain of sand can be understood and predicted through the laws of physics. But what happens once this pile emerges and the sand starts toppling over on top of itself, and little ridges start forming around the sand pile, as each grain of sand continues to be dropped, and it tumbles down in these avalanches, and more piles build up on the pile, and avalanches start falling from those piles, you can't predict it anymore. It's impossible to do the calculations to predict how the grains of sand will fall across all the avalanches at all the times. So this is considered an unpredictable, complex state, and this has been the focus of theoretical physicists trying to understand how nature works. So the sand pile, in the same way that we will experience disruptions of all sizes throughout our life, throughout the sand pile's life in this experiment, it will experience avalanches of all sizes. And this is what the study of self-organized criticality has proven out. The avalanches form as a dynamic of their own, which can be understood only from a holistic description of the properties of the entire pile, rather than from a reductionist description of individual grains. The sand pile is a complex system. So I want to talk a little bit about complexity. Complexity is very important to understand, especially in our VUCA world, where things are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So complexity is, I think, is best understood in relation to four other concepts. And these four concepts are taken from Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework, or Cynefin framework, which we'll look at in the following slide. But first, I'll share that complexity fits within simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. So if we want to use a car-based analogy, we all know about cars, even though none of us drove to this conference. My car key could be considered simple. It's just a well-defined small piece with no moving parts, and we know what it does. You stick it in the slot, you turn it, it starts the car. The car is complicated. It has a lot of pieces that fit together. And for most people, it's like magic. But for many other people, they've studied the cars. They can predict it. They can look at it. They can diagnose it. They can run analysis. They can see what's wrong. They can order parts, and they can quote out two very specific numbers. There aren't going to be very many surprises. They can predict how to fix it. That's complicated. You can predict it. It's got a lot of moving pieces, but you can understand it. Car traffic is an example of complexity. We don't know. We can't predict who's going to be looking at their phone when and drifting into another lane, or who's got some tires that are just past their baldness and about to burst, or who's sleepy, which driver is a little stressed out. We can't predict. We don't know where the traffic jams are going to occur, where the accidents are going to occur. So our approach to car traffic and our understanding of car traffic merits a different approach. Car accidents, just to round things out, are chaotic. A car accident happens, your approach to a chaotic situation is different. You're just responding. You're just trying to stay alive. You're almost operating on reflex. So this is something a little bit of could be a tangent, but that's the big shift that's happened is we were in a more complicated world before the Cold War, before a lot of this technological revolution. And now we find ourselves in a complicated world. And so it really merits a different approach or we find ourselves now in a complex world. In a complicated world, it made sense to have more of a management approach to achieving goals, where you could have expertise, analysis, and planning, right? Like the car, just figure it out, plan it out, and fix it. Whereas now we're in a complex world, which needs more to lean more on a leadership approach, where we can see our goal. We're not quite sure what's going to happen as we get there, and we just need to be working together to adapt and respond and sense our way and continuously move toward the goal despite disruptions. So this is the Cunningham framework by Snowden. And he recently, so I have, I think I said simple in the previous slide. He's since made it simple is obvious. He has actually hinted that he wants obvious to be, I don't know, a word that starts with a C, but it's not official yet. But what this is showing is that the items in blue are descriptive of the approach you would take. So a complicated, say you're looking at traditional project management and you're building maybe you're doing construction project management and you're building a home, you probably want to sense, analyze, and respond. You want to figure out what are we building? What are the dimensions, like with the foundation, right? You don't want to start pouring the foundation without knowing the specifications on it. So you want to, sense, analyze, and then do that work. Whereas complexity, where if you're trying to do things with unpredictable things emerging, you may want to move through that in more of a probe and experiment and see what's working and what's not, and work harder at what's working and avoid what isn't. So nature is complex. We are living in complex times, and our approach to that is going to be more of the probe, sense, and respond. So Kirkegaard has a cool quote for this, that life is understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. We can't predict it. We can look back and make sense of it in retrospect and adapt how we probe and sense and respond moving forward. But we must move forward, not knowing what comes next necessarily. So back to the self-organized criticality, Sandpiles. Really, a lot of the work in this theory has been to prove that there are avalanches of all sizes, and to show, and that can be shown here in this power law. I'm not going to go too far into it, other than to state that there are more smaller avalanches and fewer larger avalanches. So they measure this by the number of grains of sand that move in an avalanche. So one of the things that I think of is at the carnivals. I don't know if anybody has ever gotten suckered into doing this. I have at least a few times with my kids, where you drop the quarter in and there's the little sliding bar that pushes your quarter into the other quarters. I would imagine, I haven't read a study about it, but I would imagine that the if you, just measuring the amount of money that falls, that it would fit into one of these power laws. So I think the quarter machines probably do that. The Sandpile experiment with the avalanches does that. Earthquakes, and actually the earthquake power law was something that they knew before they started doing the Sandpile experiment. And it's something that made sense in hindsight once they discovered self-organized criticality. But they've known for a while that if you measure the magnitude frequency of earthquakes over time, you will have earthquakes of all sizes across a period of time. So you will have more smaller ones and fewer bigger ones, really along this line. The calculation comes out to what's called a power law, and that's represented by this line. Additionally, evolution, distinctions of all sizes across a period of time aligned to a power law. And so this is really what's understood as self-organized criticality and how nature works. So those are the power laws. We've got sand piles with avalanches of all sizes, earthquakes of all sizes, evolution with extinctions of different sizes over time. And this is due to continuous disruption. And one thing that's interesting about evolution that we can think of is how adaptation and basically innovation of species determines the difference between survival and extinction. So hold on to that thought. So what works and what doesn't. So so if you think of the sand pile experiment and you think, well, I'm going to control this pile so that no avalanches happen, then what you're doing is you're controlling the pile, and you're basically, what they will say in self-organized criticality, playing with fire, right? It's the self-organized critical state that is the most sustainable state in the nature of complexity. And if you try to control that, you're either going to have a completely static state where you wouldn't really call it life, or you're going to create a situation that's unbalanced and at risk of tumbling into chaos, extinction, gridlock of some manner. So what this says about, this says something really interesting about resilience. So you can think of when the sand grains are continuously falling on the sand pile and piling up into a poised critical state where an avalanche happens, when the pile doesn't just wash off the table, when the grains reorganize into a state where they then hold again to build up to another avalanche, that's resiliency. That's recovering from a disruption. So the self-organized critical state is continuously reorganizing itself, recovering from each avalanche, and the avalanche of all sizes. And this is a similar thing that happens in all self-organized critical states. And it really identifies to me really the importance of resiliency and how nature works, and how we can best see ourselves working in the flow of nature. So the question is, are we in a self-organized critical state? So I don't know if this makes sense as a slide, but I had heard this recently, and I thought, well, there's this popular song on the radio where one of the lyrics is, "Last night I took an L, but tonight I bounced back." So in life, all the time, we have things we're trying to do, and sometimes we lose, and we bounce back. We keep trying. Resiliency is a key part to how we survive and thrive in our lives in the face of disruptions of all sizes. So I want to look next to another power law, and this is the traffic jams. So traffic also, we'll note we covered traffic as an example of the complex, And in traffic, there will be traffic jams of all sizes given in any amount of time across a continuous state of traffic flow. And I want to highlight traffic. So traffic fits with this idea of how nature works. And I want to highlight traffic as interesting because inside of each one of these vehicles is a human being making decisions, and that's all part of the complex state that emerges in what we know of traffic. So this is really interesting to think about because it means that analogies that we draw from traffic are ones that are suited to how we make decisions and how we operate as humans working together to achieve a goal. So I want to look at a traffic analogy and think about how do we manage traffic performance and use that as an analogy to how we work together as organizations, any organization. So even I know the title of this talk is Will Nerd Survive? There's a sense in which Nerd is an organization of people facing disruptions of all sizes. Okay, so maybe I'll pause just for a moment to say that if Nerd as an organization is an organization that holds an annual conference, and it became extremely relevant after I proposed this talk that we would face a very big disruption to what it is that we do that is the identity of what we do. And I would say that this conference is a pretty cool example of us surviving a pretty large disruption to what it is that we do as an organization. But for traffic and for other organizations, let's look at traffic. It's really interesting. So we could say that the goal of traffic is for it to flow quickly and safely from point A to point B. So that would be high performing traffic, is traffic that flows quickly from point A to point B. So how do we manage that? There are a couple of ways that we do it. One example of managing traffic performance is the traffic light, right? So the traffic is flowing from point A to point B, and there's a spot where there's an intersection, and we need to control that, keep that safe. And the traffic light has, you stop when it's red and you go when it's green. And so you can ask some questions on this analogy in the next one. Who is in control based on the information at hand, right? Everybody stopped. The traffic light's in control. And it's based on information that was available to whoever programmed the traffic light. So it's this authority from afar, and you just have to listen to it. So you're just stopped at the red light, right? And so anybody that has been driving through a city in the middle of the night, stopped at a red light for an extreme amount of time, wondering, why can't I just go? There's no traffic. You've experienced the efficiency of the traffic light. The other form of traffic control in a similar situation is the rotary. So the rotary, if we ask the same questions, who's in control in the rotary? All the drivers are in control. And what information are they using? They're using the information that they see right in front of them. And so the rotaries are proven to be more efficient, but there's also the case of which is more difficult. So if you ask in which are values more important, you can be a jerk and you're at a red light and you just have to stop. If you're a jerk in a rotary, you can really cut some people off. So it's more important to not be a jerk in the more efficient but more difficult form of traffic control performance. So it's harder to do it a better way. But really what's happening here is the self-organization. So I wanted to point out too that I was wondering, all right, well, so what does it bear out if we ask which is more safe, right? Because the traffic light is meant to stop you and meant to let other people go. And a study in Wisconsin showed that they're called roundabouts in this slide, that actually there are the road in the rotaries or the roundabouts, smaller traffic accidents increase, little fender benders or whatnot, but the number of fatal crashes decreases substantially in the roundabout. So they are overall, I would argue, safer. And really what I think this speaks to is this idea that if you try to control a self-organized critical state, you're risking chaos. So we highlighted that on the previous slide, and I believe that the traffic light is evidence of that, because what happens is if you're going through your green light, you're not paying attention. There's no self-organization. You're not in the self-organized critical state. You're in a controlled state where you're going through a green light, but someone misses their red light, and boom, you're in a chaotic car crash. So pretty interesting, and to think about what this means for how we work together and how we get into the natural flow of things that works best for surviving and thriving in the face of complexity. So in complex systems, the self-organized critical state is the most efficient. So we can see that if we're in the self-organized critical state, of which I think the rotary is a better example than the traffic light, we are going to get accidents of all sizes, but we're going to have many fewer tinier accidents, and some, there will be some, there are always going to be some accidents, some fatal crashes, but there will be there will be fewer of those. Those will be in proportion to the overall crashes of the self-organized critical state. So one of the things that we can take from this, one of the ways that we can understand this and bring this back to our organizations and what we're trying to do, is that if we believe that self-organization and the self-organized critical state is critical to surviving and thriving in the face of disruptions and complexity, we'll want to enable the self-organizing critical phenomenon, which to do so, we must create conditions with shared goals and equivalence among members. So to tie this back to the Sandpile experiment, I think the goal can be related to the continuously dropping grains of sand. That's the continuous change that's the change that's impacting the system. And the equivalence is every grain of sand is a grain of sand. And in traffic, just might even be easier to explain, the goal of traffic is fast and safe flow, and all the cars are cars. So they're all bound by the same constraints and the same rules, roughly speaking. So in our organizations, one way to replicate this is equivalency amongst the team members, amongst the members in the organization. This is why it makes it so critical to figure out these hierarchies. If an organization wants to be a truly agile, self-organizing organization, then you'll want, understanding this helps drive this idea that clarity amongst of the goals of the organization, to getting it clear and aligned and shared to every member, is so critical, and making it so that every member is standing on equal footing with every other member is so critical to achieving the self-organizing phenomenon. So how to mutate to innovate. This is touching back on how evolution is a self-organized critical state. And these are some ways to start bringing this to your organization. And I'll point out that in the servant leadership panel, this was a question that we touched on just lightly at the end. How would you start to think about bringing servant leadership to your hierarchical organization? What I think you're really doing is bringing self-organization to a hierarchical organization. They're one and the same. If you can bring self-organization to this organization, servant leadership, a topic all on its own, will start to fall into place. So one way that you can do this is include everyone, include and unleash everyone. And this can be done with something called liberating structures. One of the most easy to understand liberating structures called 1, 2, 4 all. And that includes every one person invites each one person to think of an answer to a question. It could be a question, so we could try it right now. I'm not sure how we're doing. Looks like we've got, how much time do we have? When's this end? 4?
Yes.
So we could try it right here. So really liberating structures is you unleash everyone to deliberate and learn together. So if we were to do a 1, 2, 4 all, actually, I'm not sure. We got 14 people. I wasn't planning on doing it in a 45-minute talk, so I'll just explain it. So we would ask, so you can think to yourself as an individual, what control might we try using transparency instead? Okay, so right now at our organizations, everything may be top-down controlled, and so how do we start bringing equivalence and transparency and self-organization to our hierarchical organization? So we could start to think about what, an answer to this question as each person, and then we could partner up and share what each of us thought as 2 people together. And then those 2 pairs could pair up with another 2 pairs, and as a group, share what they think. And then as the group of all the groups, we could share what were the most impactful ideas. So really what you've done is you've put every single individual on an equal footing to share their ideas. Even if they're introverted, it was easier for them to share with that one other person than with the whole group. And their idea was probably a great one, and it made it all the way out to the group of groups sharing with everybody. Another technique to unleash everyone is to do open spaces as large companies, to come up with topics. Anybody can come up with a topic. Anyone that's interested in a topic can go to that topic and communicate with the others. So rather than a few people at the tippy top of an organization deciding what matters, you open it up to everybody in an open space. It's basically what an unconference or a birds of a feather is, where people control their content. And you can really, as an organization, form initiatives that way to see what everybody in the organization thinks and where what they gravitate to and what they're passionate about doing. So if we have equivalence, then no one is in charge and we all need a way to decide. So, right, so that's something that you'll want to consider if you, in order to survive and thrive in the face of disruption and be a self-organizing organization to be able to do that, you're going to need equivalence. But if you have that, then it's like, well, who's deciding? So a couple of techniques to look into deeper for this is sociocracy includes a round robin, where in a group you want to hear from everybody. It includes a double linking between groups. So this can be applied to a hierarchical organization to start migrating it to more of an equivalency organization by turning the kind of like the senior leader and the middle manager circles, and instead getting someone from each group into the other groups as equal decision makers, right? So if you have like a senior leadership team and they have direct reports, we'll include somebody from those direct report groups in your senior leadership team and include them as a equal decision maker. And the way you would do that is with sociocracy's consent-based decision making. And so what that is every decision that you're making, you don't seek consensus, you seek consent. So you try to, as a group, work getting better at coming up with things to try that everyone in the group has no objection to. So they don't have to agree that it's their favorite way to go about it or that they think it's the right choice, but they decide that they can live with trying it. So that gets you to, as a group, find safer, smaller decisions to make, to probe your way through finding the right decision to make. And if you're including the member from those other circles through sociocracy's double linking and including them as someone who could object and help modify the situation to be something that they could accept as a representative from their group, you've created equivalency across those groups within your hierarchy. So it's a place to start. So if we were doing from the last slide, if we had come up with an answer to what control might we start using, as we could replace with a form of transparency, then we could practice consent-based decision-making, to say like, okay, I could live with trying that. So one example that I like of replacing control with transparency is with budgeting. If you say, okay, there's no budget anymore, you can spend what you want, you just have to publish it in a company visible place where everybody can see what you spent. So you've said, okay, you've taken away the control of the budget, you've replaced it with, you have to be transparent about how you did it. What happens is, the hypothesis is that costs will go down because people don't want to be seen as frivolous and wasteful. And this is actually a proven hypothesis across several studies. And so we could say, okay, well, let's try doing that at our organization. To practice being a group that does consent-based decision-making, we would say something like, does anybody object to trying this with one of our budgets in one of our departments? So somebody might say, well, I object, which department, which budget? So we might say, okay, we'll try it with the sales department and we'll do it with their travel budget. And it might be like, okay, everybody can live with that. So we've all made that as equals. There wasn't like a single authority, like a traffic light of our organization saying, do this now. And then once we've raised awareness with liberating structures and deliberated with liberating structures and decided with some of this, with things that come from things like what comes from sociocracy, we can act and react with our agility, with our agile methodologies. There are lots of them out there. Scrum and Kanban are two popular ones, and even just different business agility and personal agility thinking. So for example, in our organizations and whatever it is that we're doing, there is probably somebody that consumes our work, and the customer is very important. And so there's a sense in which customer happiness is both a goal and that drip of constant change, to tie it back to the dripping grains of sand. We are continuously facing changing customer needs, and we need to be able to act and react with agility. We need to be delivering value, but also listening and learning to those to the disruptions, the disruptions of all sizes that we're embracing and becoming aware of and learning from and responding to. All right. Another interesting thing to consider about disruption is that there are other disruptors that they're also evolving. So if we think of our competition, I don't know if we really think of NERD as having, I'm sure NERD has competition. Everybody has to decide, like, well, for example, it's interesting, MidCamp, it overlapped with NERD Summit. A lot of people that go to the conferences like NERD Summit also try to go to MidCamp, so they had to make a decision. So I guess there's a sense in which we have some competition, but other organizations have other competition. And what happens in evolution is there's what's called the Red Queen effect. And it's based on this part from Alice in Wonderland. Well, in our country, said Alice, still panting a little, you generally get to somewhere else if you ran very fast for a long time, as we've been doing. A slow sort of country, said the Queen. Now here you see it takes all the running you can do just to keep in the same place. So even if we're not, we still have to innovate in a sense, or continuously evolve, continuously improve. We still have to act in this way because our competition is continuously evolving. So in basic evolution, if you're a critter that is likely to get eaten by another critter, and you've evolved to avoid that, but then the thing that eats you evolves in a way that eats you better, you've got to evolve just to stay safe, just to stay in one place. So we can't really, this isn't like an optional thing. We can't say like, oh, well, maybe we don't want to thrive, or we don't want to necessarily take this leap. Just staying in the same place is not necessarily the safest approach. So conclusions for our organization: think about how self-organized criticality is nature's defense against disruption. It's its form of resilience, and systemic resilience innovates. So you can think about how in evolution, critters evolve, they adapt, and they evolve. Basically, innovations. They solve the challenges of life in new ways, and that is how they survive and thrive. So there's a systemic kind of aspect to evolution, which I think is really interesting. And there's a lot of things that I think tie back into the keynote from earlier today, where how diversity relates to innovation very strongly, and really can help a lot with making our innovation systemic. So conclusions for the leader in all of us, and this could be for the nerd in all of us: avalanches will happen in complexity. You may be able to hold in your minds that image of the emotional life cycle of a project. There's going to be a honeymoon period. There's going to be a disruption or something that doesn't work out too well, and then there's a recovery and an adaptation. And self-organized criticality shows that being a self-organizing team is going to get you through that valley of despair much faster. And I don't know if anybody's experienced this, but if something's happening in a project where something goes wrong and you try to hide that or control that, when you get to that low valley of despair in the project, it's much worse, and you're not going to have the transparency or equivalence amongst all involved to get you out of that and back to recovery on that project. And so controlling can be catastrophic. So I think we want to ask ourselves as leaders or as nerds, what could you do if you saw a potential disruption, and would it be effective? So I feel like we're pretty self-organizing as organizers in the nerd organization. And I feel like that's a big reason why, people had ideas, people saw issues with how we were trying to think about solving the problem and continue to meet our goal of having a summit. And if there are any places where, any of our members, any of our organizers felt like that they saw a problem and they tried to do something about it and it wasn't effective, that's something that we as an organization, we want to surface and try to make it easier for people to call out, potential issues and have whatever it is that they think to do be effective for us to adapt to their perspective on or accommodate for their perspective. How are decisions made? Are they inclusive or exclusive? What are the pros and cons? Really think about how the decisions are made in your organization, and so if we believe that the self-organized critical state is really the best for surviving and thriving, how do we decentralize more of those decisions? What decisions does it make sense to decentralize, and do we all have a say in how that works? And really, will our organizations act fast enough? If we even get to this point of once we've made a decision, will we be able to act fast enough for it to matter? So I think when I think of these last couple of bullet points, I think about how we were trying to figure out whether to keep the summit or not, and we felt like we were flying blind, and we did a survey, and it kind of felt like, geez, this is getting to be pretty last minute. So it could be that we can improve things there. We never had to change course that quickly before, but I feel like the virtual summit is an example of how we were able to act fast enough. But these are always things that we can look at improving.
Hey, Kelly.
Yep.
We're right at 4 o'clock.
Yep. I think that I'm right up. So think about what you can take back to your organization and try. Here are some resources if you want to snap a screenshot, and they'll get shared out. Some of this stuff is directly in the talk. Other pieces of it is either motivating or would be recommended for reading for further deeper dives into related information. And we either have time for thoughts or we're done. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah, I'll make a PDF of this and put it in the let's put it in the Agile Methods Slack channel, #Agile-methods. I'll put it in there. And we can continue the conversation in there too.
Great. The recording will also be on YouTube.
Excellent.
Cool. Thank you, everybody. I don't have anything until 4:15, so I don't know if anybody has all that thought-provoking content has any questions or any
Kelly, I do have a comment. So Nassim Taleb wrote Black Swan, and he and several other books. And most recent, or one of the recent books, was Anti-Fragile.
Yeah.
He talks about organizations and societies that become stronger as the result of injury rather than just returning to the original state.
Yep.
He also talks about I guess it would be in your matrix, the complex.
Yep.
I mean, the chaotic.
Okay.
High impact, rare, and unpredicted events, such as what we're going through right now. And how do we deal with that? And if we try to deal with it in the traditional ways of TSA throwing away 3-ounce or larger than 3-ounce bottles of hand sanitizer in the airports because somehow that was going to protect our planes.
Yeah.
We spent trillions of dollars on chasing bin Laden and didn't become stronger as a country. So I think that, and again, this is one of the things that I'm trying to wrestle with in this notion is where are places in which we do become stronger as a result of this current crisis? Where do we become more than just, with the avalanche metaphor, it kind of returns to a steady state, which then accumulates more and more sand grains.
Yep.
But it doesn't transform into, I guess maybe over time it transforms into diamonds or into glass, but it doesn't become other than what it had been before, except smaller and rebuilds. So I think what I'd like to think about and then perhaps have in a future conversation is how do we deal with the chaotic? How do we, as organizations and as individuals, become stronger in chaotic moments?
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing this up because I haven't really carved out time to think about it, but just thinking about your question and drawing from all the slides that we just talked about. So it's true that some things are going to be chaotic, and in the framework that we looked at, the approach is to act, sense, and respond. So there are going to be things where we just have to take action. But I think it's in that sensing that we can find an understanding of what's going on that brings at least pieces of it more into the complex. So we kind of carve out parts of what we're experiencing as complex, and we can approach those with a probe, sense, and respond. Mm-hmm. And so somewhere in that, I think too, we can take from some of the slides about transparency and self-organization and think about like some of the things that are going on right now, which are counter to that. Like there's a lot of withholding of information because people, there's a lot of information coming out where it seems like the leaders that we're trusting with this are withholding information until they can sell their stocks. And there, you know, there are things that are happening that seem to be reducing the amount of testing we can do, and it's really, you know, there's no equivalency. So we can look at, you know, if we want to get more to a state where we're going to stand a chance to recover from this avalanche, we've got to find ways to understand what our goal is and get alignment on that goal, and be equivalent, have an equivalency of all the members, and that means that administrations need to get better, need to be sharing information more transparent.
One other thing that I want to throw into the mix on the traffic metaphor, the Waze or the Google Map effect, where traditionally we control traffic by having fixed maps, and we routed people through rotaries or we sent them through traffic lights. And now with the real-time sensing that goes on with Waze and Google Maps, people are finding that, oh, gee, it's faster to cut through this neighborhood. Oh, gee, it's faster to, and this, you know, this happened to us on a trip to, you know, down south. You know, there was construction on the road, so it sent us through these quirky little neighborhoods in Connecticut that weren't used to seeing such traffic, but it allowed us to avoid a 5-mile backup.
Yeah.
And that is, I don't know if that's complex or chaotic. Certainly for the people who live on those streets, it's chaotic because they never had to deal with 100 cars going by, you know, on a regular stream. So I think you might want to be thinking about that in terms of having sensing ability beyond our human limitations and being able to draw from technology and actually crowdsourcing it, because you know that's being learned by other drivers who are on those similar roads.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I think that I would first propose that perhaps might be an example of using the Google mapping technology to help traffic go from becoming complex to being more of the complicated, because you can monitor more things. It makes it so that it reduces some of the complexity, some of the unpredictability by adding sensors and rerouting.
Yeah, there's discussion right now, you know, do we allow the CDC to have access to our smart thermometers
Right.
as a way of tracking the progression, perhaps, of COVID-19?
Yep. Yeah, maybe and there's probably monitors that they do that we should have access to.
Mm-hmm.
All right.